Hi and welcome back. Today I needed a little bit of cheering up, so I'm going to be painting this idyllic little summer scene with these two pretty little cottages, and I'm going to see if I can get some nice random flower effects in the garden, in this sort of English country garden, using salt effects. I'm going to paint it as a line and wash using waterproof fine liner pens to draw in the outline of the cottages first. I'm going to use two types of pens and swap between four of them. The first ones are these cream coloured barrel pens, and they are my what are they called? They are my Pigma Microns, and I've got the 0.5 and the 0.8. So I'll be swapping between those, the two finest ones I'll be using to outline my cottages and to block in small details like the window panes, and just to get all the darkest darks in with my pens. Now for the much larger dark areas of shadow, I should be using the black barreled pens, and they are my Faber-Castell artist pit pens, and I've got a soft brush pen and a brush pen. There's not much difference between the two of them. The brush pen nib is a little bit stiffer than the soft brush pen, but the brush pen itself is running out a bit, so I'm using the soft brush pen just to make sure I get some nice dark lines where I need the shadows. The paper I'm using today is 100% cotton, and it's by Saunders Waterford. It's cold pressed, so there's a bit of texture. That should make it nice and easy to paint, but not too difficult to draw on with the fine liners. I think if you use rough paper for line and wash, it can be a little bit difficult because your pen will sort of skip over the textured bumps in the paper, and it's even easier with smooth hot press paper, but hot press paper can be a little bit trickier to paint on, so cold press paper is a great compromise between those two textures. As I say, it's Saunders Waterford cold press paper. It's 11 inches by 15 inches or 28 centimetres by 38 centimetres. Now I've got it taped to my drawing board using ordinary decorator's masking tape, and my drawing board is set on my table easel, which is made by Arteza. It's a table easel, and it's clipped to the board or to the easel at an angle of about 45 degrees, so that when I come to paint, gravity will help me with the painting, and the paint should naturally flow down the page as I paint, and that should help me to get a really natural looking sky. When I first started this painting, I made sure that I got my pencil drawing right first. In other words, I made sure that my cottages were set at the right sort of perspective, the right angle, and in the right proportions, and then roughed in some trees and some sort of borders for hedgerows and maybe some of the sort of flower bushes and things like that. I'm thinking of having some roses in the garden, and I think one of the cottages will have a red door. So I'm working across my paper, getting in all my darkest darks with the waterproof fine liners, and of course obviously the outline, which is the main thing that you have with a line and wash, which makes it different from a sort of pure watercolour painting. My lightest lights, I have to spare out or keep them white by not painting them. So I will be making sure that I keep some of the unpainted paper on my cottages, maybe a few sparkles and little bits of white unpainted paper in the garden area to add some liveliness and freshness to the greenery. but I will also be keeping some of the white unpainted paper in my sky for clouds. So when I paint, the paint is only going to be providing me with all my midtones, maybe a few slightly darker midtones, but it's mostly going to be midtones. With line and wash, the darkest darks are provided by the ink pens, and the lightest lights by the white, the natural unpainted white of the paper. I'm going to be putting in enough detail across the garden area below and around the cottages to help integrate them into the painting and to keep some sort of continuity across the whole of the paper. I'm doing that by just gently sort of dotting and dashing in the outlines of a few sort of the bushes, either flower bushes or trees, shrubs of some sort, and putting in a few indications here and there, quite dark, of fences, sort of garden fences and, picket fence or something like that here and there. And I'll have a little fence further over towards the left, just where I'm going to have a bit of a tree. So using my imagination here and making this up, it's going to be quite fun and quite sort of liberating to just play around with sort of shapes and ideas and try and go for this pretty little English cottage garden, very informal and pretty, very charming, sort of chocolate box cottage type thing, pure escapism. Just getting in those darker tones for the trees and the bushes. When I come to paint, I shall be using a fairly limited palette, maybe a few more colours than usual. I'm going to use cobalt blue for the sky and a bit of raw sienna to give me some sort of shadows and some light in the sky and around the clouds. And then I think I'll use two ready-made greens, sap green and perylene green, for that garden. Sap green is a very fresh, bright green, sort of splits out into sort of yellowy tones if it's mixed with a lot of water. And perylene green is a deep, rich, sort of blue-black green, which can give some lovely shadows very quickly and easily. It's an artist quality paint, and it's made by Winsor & Newton, and one of my favourite colours. And then to add some highlights to the garden area, I shall be adding some burnt sienna, and then at the end of the painting, some alizarin scarlet lake will give me my red roses. And of course, once I've added my washes, I'm going to be adding some salt to give me some pretty white flowers as well. Today I'm painting a wet on dry sky, so I'm using this nice watery raw sienna and my Escoda Ultimo synthetic size 14 round brush to start off the sky onto the dry paper. Now I'm mixing up some cobalt blue, and I'll put that across the top of the tape with the same brush, scrubbing it sort of fairly randomly to spread the paint out, adding a little bit more water to thin it out here and there so I get some different hues and tones of the blue, leaving the white unpainted paper areas for a few of these little soft scudding clouds. And you can see where the cobalt blue is mingling with the raw sienna. I'm just getting those sort of nice shadow tones, but also keeping a bit of a glow in the sky for that sunny sunlit look. Adding a bit more water, dabbing the brush onto a tissue to take out the excess water, and then thinning out the sky across near the base of the garden. I don't mind it's with the paint going across the roofs, because the roofs are going to be darker, and that starts off a nice bit of tone there, because watercolour is transparent, so any thin layers you get of paint will show through when you paint other layers on top, and it all adds to the character. And of course, with the thin glazes of paint, you get the lovely transparent quality of the light reflecting on the paper underneath, which is what gives us such beautiful skies when we paint watercolours in this sort of way. This next stage is not for the faint-hearted, but trust me, hopefully it'll work out okay. This is really thick and very rich perylene green with a bit of sap green on the brush too, and you can see I've very quickly used my size 14 brush to fill in those areas, the main areas underneath the cottage of the garden. And now I'm thinning out the paint by adding a bit of water to the brush, dragging it randomly across the garden area. I want those lovely shadowy greens underneath the cottages and around the hedgerows there to give the cottages that lovely sunlit look, because the dark green hedgerows should really focus the eye on the walls, the windows and the door of the cottages, as they are a lot lighter. But I'm making sure that my paint isn't too thick by sort of spreading it around a bit, but still keeping that lovely intensity. Accents of burnt sienna here and there in large sweeps across the foreground, and smaller dabs just to highlight on the horizon line and around the cottage area, really help this green to pop, because the burnt sienna is a lovely sort of orangey rusty colour, and so it's the perfect complement for the green. So that's my basic washes finished, so I'm going to lay my board flat and have a look at my washes, and while they're still wet but not too wet and not too dry, just moist, then I can sprinkle some ordinary table salt, finely ground, onto the wet paint where it's damp. If it's too wet, then the salt will dissolve and you'll get no effects, or possibly a bit of a muddy mess. And if it's too dry, the salt won't do what it's supposed to do, which is to just disperse the paint slightly so you get these tiny little salt bloom flowers. So it's worth practicing the timing of your paper and the wetness of your paper with salt on the back of an old painting before you try it in a sort of finished painting, so to speak. So you want it just damp, not too wet and not too dry, and then leave it to dry completely. And I always allow the salt to dry naturally, because I find you get better effects that way. If you add heat, you can sometimes bake the salt into your paint and it's harder to get out. Now the salt's nearly dry now, so while it's just finishing drying, I'll add a bit of colour to my cottages. First of all, this is some burnt sienna with a tiny bit of burnt umber added to it across the roof. And I shall mix up a slightly lighter, sort of browner mixture for this roof. So there's a slight difference between the colours of those two roofs. Now some raw sienna, I'm just going to dash it here and there, quite randomly, there's no method to this, on the wall of the cottages, the walls of the cottages, and leave the rest of the paper white. That little dash of colour just adds enough colour to the walls, I think, to allow them to look like they've got dappled sunlight on them, but still keeping it nice and pale. And this is a little bit more of that raw sienna into the chimney stacks, so they look slightly different brick to the tile on the roof. And then back to that sort of rich rusty brown for the chimney pots. And for this I'm using my small calligraphy brush, and for the roof I used a 3/4 inch synthetic flat brush. This calligraphy brush is just one, it's unbranded, that I just found very cheap on eBay. Any small round brush or a rigger brush would do for these details. Bit more raw sienna on the flat brush and just filling in a few little gaps here and there behind the fence, just to make sure that there's some colour behind there. Maybe a bit of tone across that large white patch in the foreground, but not too much, just to take away from the white of the paper there, so that the white in my sky stands out even more. Just a little bit here and there, something and nothing. And now at this stage, my salt's completely dry, so I've brushed it off and it's left me some lovely little patches of these lovely sort of white flowers here and there. I'm very, very pleased with it. I think it links quite nicely. Now the finishing touches is the red door with my alizarin crimson or alizarin scarlet lake, which is a Sennelier colour, my handmade watercolours. And now for the roses, just adding a few more pops, tiny little pops of red here and there into the bushes and around the cottages, which helps to sort of link in the red door with the rest of the painting, but it also adds that really pretty impression of roses sort of around the door and around the cottage. So these are just little dots and dashes into the bushes that have already been painted. I'm going to try not to overdo this, but I want to have enough of them to really make this little informal English cottage garden pop. It gives it that lovely, comforting, feel-good look, if you know what I mean. I'd love to live in a little cottage like that, I think, with roses around my door. I think most of us would. And then when the painting is almost finished, I like to just sort of stop what I'm doing and then stand back and take a look and assess if there's anything else that needs doing. And I've decided I need to darken up this roof a bit more over on the right side, so that the cottage on the far right sticks forward a little bit more. It's sort of brought forward. So I'm going to darken up the roof and then dab off a little bit of that dark on the left side of the cottage roof with a tissue, gently keeping the dark shadow on the right side. Just checking that all the salt has been brushed off, and yep, as far as I can tell, that's fine. So here it is with the tape removed, and you can see it with its clean white border, and that shows the painting as a finished painting, almost as if it was framed and mounted or matted. So let's take a slightly closer look, and if we look more closely, you can see how the line work or the black ink work is really effective to define the cottages, the tiles on the roof and the little garden details like the fence and some of the trees and the shadows in the shrubs, etc. And the salt effects are really, really pretty. Just that very delicate dusting of salt really helps to focus the eye on the main event, which is the cottages and the roses and all those little details. So here we want the foreground to just be fairly nondescript, but to still have enough interest in it. And I think the light green washes with a bit of burnt sienna and the salt in it has done that job for this painting very nicely. Well, I hope you found that useful. I'm pleased with this because I've got that lovely sort of summer sky and that idyllic cottage English country garden look that I was looking for. So I hope you'll give something like this a go. It can be an awful lot of fun, and line and wash is a nice, easy technique. It's a matter of just being able to get the cottages right first with your line work, and then really just sort of painting in and playing around with the washes just to get them the way you like them, and then waiting for the timing of the paper to be right for the salt, so not too wet and not too dry. So thanks for watching. Please leave us a like if you enjoyed the video and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And thanks so much to my lovely Patreon group who support this channel. And I'll see you again soon, and happy painting. Bye.